Well, if you want to open up to Job, we're going to be running through the book of Job tonight, and I will do my best to at least point you to some things to pay attention to. Not going to say I'll do my best to help you understand the book of Job. I think that, not really sure that I can. I'll try and I'll tell you about that some, but I really like this book, but this is one of those books that could potentially consume you. Like you could devote yourself to understanding Job and then you wouldn't get much farther because there is a lot here. It's like the Psalms. There's just a lot here. And so I'm excited to talk about it tonight. There's a lot of fun stuff in this book and a lot of interesting stuff. I hope, this is one of my hopes with these overviews. I always hope that one of the things, I show favoritism to the things that are interesting to me. But maybe one of the things that's interesting to you will cause you to want to go home and open up your Bible and say, I don't know, maybe I'll look at that with my family tonight before I go to bed. And you will feel interested about it and investigate it yourself. So I'm excited tonight. I like this book. It's frustrating, but it's also fun and enlightening in a lot of ways. Confusing in a lot of ways. I want to tell you something, though, before I get started. I invited myself to the elders and deacons meeting tonight. There's a lot of stuff that I got a wish list and some things that they let me participate with, and so I'm very grateful for that. But I don't know. I don't want to exaggerate when I say this, but I don't know that I have ever felt more optimistic moving forward, just to look at like where we sit versus the potential that exists and the steps that our shepherds are taking to try to organize this chaos that has existed and to organize it and say, okay, now you take this thing and be great. And tonight will be one of those nights that I have a hard time falling asleep because of excited. So I hope that it feels overwhelming too. I'm not sure that I'll be able to get my head straight with Job tonight because there's a lot of stuff swimming around in here right now, but I'll do my best with that. But I hope that you do feel the sense of excitement and optimism because, boy, we got a great church family. We've got great leadership. We've got great guys ready to go. And I don't really know what else you could ask for. So, all right. Let's start with the date of Job. One of the things that comes up all the time is if everybody's truthful about the date of Job, then the true answer is going to be, we don't know when the book was written. You just need to put that. Like if you're going to write down information about when Job was put together, the real true answer is we don't know. But there is also, that's what will happen. If you're reading through a commentary, it'll say, we don't know when it was written, but. And then there's lots of things that are pretty universal to say. The names and the places in the book of Job kind of give you an indication that this is super early. So, you know in the story in Job chapter 1, when the raiders came and they raid Job and they take all of his stuff, we'll read that in just a second. The raiders they're listed as the Sabians and the Chaldeans. Well, the Chaldeans eventually become Babylonians. But right now, they're wandering raiders who take other people's stuff. And so if you're going to refer to the Chaldeans, eventually the Babylonians, as a group of people before they were organized into Babylonians, we are super early. Because even at the time of Abraham, Babylon was a thing. And so, that's one of the things that kind of points to this. Job's wealth is made up of flocks and slaves, and he's got a lot of kids, and so he's considered rich. And that sounds an awful lot like the patriarch time. And Job is the head of his household, who is also a priest. His kids, I think we'll read this in a second too. His kids get together on a regular basis, and they have their feast, and then Job offers sacrifices and serves as a priest over his own household, which at least that's before the time of the law of Moses. At least that's before the law of Moses, but probably even way earlier before the time of Moses. Job lives to 140 years old at the end of the book, and you're not into the crazy years of people who live that really long Methuselah-style stuff, but this is still a long life, which points to earlier in time, in some of the early chapters. And then it says at the end of the book that he died an old man and full of days, and that just sounds a lot like that's what you read about with the patriarchs. Abraham died an old man full of days. And so this is the thing that I want you to think about with this. And again, always just take this with a grain of salt and be really careful about it. You can't say any of this stuff with certainty that it is this early, written in the time of the patriarchs. But consider this. Here's Moses. Moses leads the children of Israel out of Egyptian slavery. He gives them the 10 Commandments, and this 40-year period of wandering, Moses is present for that. And during this time, this is when Moses writes Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the first books of the Bible that take us all the way back. So Moses wrote those books right here. But if Job really is this early, written in the time of the patriarchs, and he is living in the time of the patriarchs, it's somewhere in this neighborhood, then that would put Job as the earliest book of the Bible. I don't know if you think about that very often, because we always say Genesis talks about the creation. Genesis 1 through 11 talks about this period of time, but it's not written until later. But it's possible that Job is actually in that period of time, which would make it a really old book. And that to me, if that's right, that to me makes Job even more interesting, to see people thinking about the problem of evil and the nature of evil in the world and why suffering happens and what we can understand about it and what we can't understand about it, that was happening all the way back in the time of the patriarchs. That is a really interesting thing. And so since I can't say any of that really with certainty, I'm not gonna go into extra things about that, but I think it's at least worth talking about. This is the outline of the book of Job that I'm going to follow. Again, as always, anything that I have, I will share with you always. And so if you don't want to write all of this down, then I understand. And there's also going to be more that I say about some of these things, but if you can write it down if you want, but if you don't want to, I'll share it with you, the slide in my notes. But I want to go through this outline and draw on some high points, I think. If I say to you, we're going to take a look at the book of Job, my guess is probably most of you would think of Job chapters 1 and 2, and then the very last 10 verses or so. Because that's the part of the book that's fun to read and easy to understand. It's a narrative, it's a story. Everybody, if you think of Job, you're like, hey, cool, Job, I'm going to read these chapters. And you read chapters 1 and 2, and it's a fun time. And then you get to chapter 3, and especially chapter 4, and it's not as fun anymore. So let's start with the fun stuff. Job chapters 1 and 2. Let's just look at verses 1 through 5. There's a couple things about this that are, if you know what's coming in the book of Job, there's a couple things going on in these first 5 chapters that really, like, ding, 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 you can pay attention to. Verse 1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. Okay. So this is going to be like one of the main points of argument throughout this book. Job, I think you're suffering because you've done something to deserve it. Well, we find out right in the first verse of the book, that's not true. Job is a good guy. He lists it, and there's more than even this verse that's listed here. He's blameless. He's upright. He fears God. He turns away from evil. All the things that he's going to be blamed for, as we move through the book, we're told right from the start, no, that's not right. In verse 2, there were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all people in the East. One of the things that's going to come up again and again is Job's friends are going to say to him, Job, you're suffering, and all of this bad stuff has happened to you because you must have done something to bring it on yourself. You've sinned, and this is a curse, and God is punishing you, or something wrong is going on here. And the book starts off by saying, no, Job is a good guy. And not only that, he is exceptionally blessed. And so if we're going to, we're already arguing against Job's friends in these verses. If we're going to come at Job in the book and say, well, Job, this is the way that I think it works, that God blesses those who are righteous and God curses and punishes those who are wicked, then what are we going to say about Job in these first 3 verses? He's a good guy in every way, and not only that, but he is exceptionally blessed. He's got lots of stuff. So by your reasoning, Job's friends, by your reasoning, he's all right. He's blessed by God. He's not done anything. He deserves everything that he's got. Verse 4. His sons used to go hold a feast in the house of each one on his day, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters and eat and drink with them. And when the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offering according to the number of all of them. For Job said, it must be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus Job did continually. And so not only is he a righteous man who is, if you're just listening to this, you won't ever be able to hear this, but he's blessed by God. He's righteous and blessed by God because of his righteousness, according to this line of thinking. If you want to add something to that list, like he's a religious-minded guy. And he also is concerned to intercede on behalf of his own family and their sin. And he's concerned about sin. And he wants to make sure that sin is not something that exists within his family. We learn, this is what we're going to do with these first 5 verses. You read the first 5 verses and then you read the whole book of Job. And if you come back to these first 5 verses when you're done, you can see that we're already arguing even before the argument starts in what's going on here. And so I'm not going to be able to, this is what I'll do. I will spend all my time on the first 2 chapters because this is what's fun and easy, and then not leave any time left. So I'll hurry up through some of this. Verse 6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also among them. The Lord said to Satan, from where have you come? Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down on it. And the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, blameless and upright man, who fears God and turns away from evil? You can add that to your list. Even God himself said that Job is a righteous and upright man. Satan answered the Lord and said, does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. And we won't read the actual next verses, but what happens is Satan takes everything from Job. Everything. He loses his family, he loses his stuff, he loses everything except for he's still healthy. And then in chapter 2 and verse 1, again there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" And Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil? He still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason." Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Skin for skin. All that a man has, he will give for his life, but stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he is in your hand, only spare his life." And so Satan makes Job's life awful. Now here's something to think about before we dive into this book. You know, we are the only ones who know the real story about Job, reading the book. As far as we can tell, Job never knew any of this. That's going to be something really big. Like they're all saying, this is why it's happening, and this is why it's happening, and you did this to deserve it. And Job says, no, I didn't do it, and this is why I think it's going on, and this is what I think is happening. Nobody knows. They don't know what's happening. We, the reader, know what's going on because we just got to see behind the spiritual curtains when Satan is inciting God. But Job and his friends, nobody ever knows what's really going on. And so you have to consider from Job's perspective and also from his friend's perspective as they're reasoning through a lot of the, well, this is what I think and this is how the world works and all of this stuff, that they don't know. They don't know what's going on. I'll have something else to say about that in just a second. Chapter 3 then starts this dialogue between Job and his three friends who have come to sit with him while he's in misery. And this is what I would do. So if I were you and you're interested in Job, this is the thing to do with it. Every single Bible study, I guess this is my opinion. I can't inflict this on other people, but every single text that I come to has 3 steps. It never is any more difficult than that. You come to a Bible passage and you say, what does it say? What does it mean? And what does it mean for me? That's every single Bible study. Those are the only 3 things that you do. With the book of Job in chapter 3 and with all of this other dialogue between his friends, it's really hard to get past stage 1. Because you'll read all of these words, and the hardest part is figuring out what they're saying. Like you can read their arguments, and some of it is like, oh, hey, I know what that means. But if you really want to dive into the book of Job, this would be the thing that I would do. I would read one speech at a time. So Job chapter 3, for example, where Job starts his speeches. I would read Job chapter 3, and I would not move on until I was able to articulate, this is what Job is saying in chapter 3. And it's hard. It's going to be really hard to do that. Not Job chapter 3. It starts off a little bit easy. But as you go into these different cycles, Job speaks, then Eliphaz. Then Job speaks, then Bildad. Then Job speaks, then Zophar. Then Job responds. That's cycle 1. And you go through these different cycles. It gets harder and harder to figure out what they're saying. This is what prompts the whole problem in the first place. Job chapter 3, starting in verse 1. This one's not hard to understand. After this, Job opened his mouth and he cursed the day of his birth. And Job said, let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said, a man is conceived. Let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor light shine upon it. Job goes throughout this chapter and he says, I wish I was never born. And you can't really blame the guy. I mean, from our perspective, he has he has lost everything, and now he's even lost his health. And he says, I just wish at this point that I was never born. And that makes some sense to think why a person would think that. And so Eliphaz comes and speaks to him. Look at chapter 4. Chapter 4, starting in verse 1. This is where it gets a little tougher. Okay, so Job says, I wish I was never born. Then what does Eliphaz say in response? 4 in verse 1. Eliphaz the Temanite answered and said, if one ventures a word with you, will you be impatient? Yet who can keep from speaking? Behold, you have instructed many, and you have strengthened the weak hands. Your words have upheld him who was stumbling, and you have made firm the feeble knees. But now it has come to you, and you are impatient. It touches you, and you are dismayed. Is not your fear of God, your confidence, the integrity of your ways, your hope? Eliphaz starts off by saying to Job, Job, you know better than this. You know better than this, Job, to say, I wish I was never born in the first place. And Eliphaz says, Job, you are always the guy who comforts people in their time of need. You know better than this. And one of the things that he says, look at verse 7. Remember, who that was innocent ever perished? Do you see the implication from the very start? Job, you know better than this, Job. What righteous and innocent person in this world ever died? And maybe this is something like, you and I will have this conversation. One of our kids gets themselves into trouble, or they hurt themselves or something like that, and they're like, I didn't do anything. And I always am like, yeah, nobody ever did anything, did they? Bad things just happen to people all the time. And we didn't do anything to cause it. And that's what Eliphaz is saying to Job. He says, who was innocent ever perished? Or where were the upright cut off? As I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. That's my experience, Job. If you want to plow iniquity, you're gonna plow trouble. If you want to plow this trouble, you're going to reap trouble. All of this stuff. And what he's really doing, it starts off in a nice way. But what he's really doing is he's starting with the implication, Job, this bad stuff that's happened to you, you've brought it on yourself. And, have you ever thought about this? Well, Jim and Sherry, you guys just read Job, right? You just finished up Job. Do you ever think about this whenever you read through the book of Job? Job is Facebook 1.0. It is, as you read through it. You got a bunch of people talking about stuff they don't know anything about. And then somebody comments, and then another person responds and doesn't really respond to what was said. He's just saying anything. And everybody's talking over everybody else. And then what happens, so it starts off like Eliphaz is halfway civil about saying you brought this on yourself. But then what happens is it gets more and more personal as it goes. So we're leaving the real discussion about why bad things happen, and it's turned into you are an evil person and you brought it on yourself. And I don't say that, when I say Facebook 1.0, I'm not really joking when I say that. And that's not a very endearing cycle to get caught up in. I hope that we can appreciate that. Maybe one of the things to learn about this. And so I think what you do, I'm not going to dive into each one of these speeches, but I think what you do is you read Eliphaz's speech. So Job chapter 4 and 5. And you don't move on until you figure out what Eliphaz is saying to Job. You have to figure that out. and write it in the margin of your Bible or write it on a piece of paper or do something. And once you've figured out what Eliphaz says, then move on to Job's response. And that's going to really be, and it's going to go slow. You're going to have to take your time. It's going to take you forever to do this. But if you want to dive into the book of Job, that's the way that you're going to need to do it, to figure out what they're saying. So there's that. There's this conversation back and forth. And most of the conversation is, you deserve this, Job. And Job says, no, I don't. I haven't done anything to deserve this. There's another thing that I want to point you to, though, that is a really big feature. Look at chapter 9. You can see an example of this in chapter 9 in verses 2 and 3. One of the things that Job does, and you will see this a lot in his speeches, is Job says, you know what I want? I want a trial with God. I want to stand before God, and I want my day in court, where I can stand before God and say to him, I have not done anything to deserve this, and I want to hear what God has to say to me about that. It's that, this is the way that I phrased it in my notes anyway, this feature that you see in so many of Job's speech. He's, I said asking for a trial. He's almost demanding a trial. I want to say my piece to God. And so look, I'll just give you two examples of this. Chapter 9 and verse 2. Truly I know that it is so, but how can a man be in the right before God? If one wished to contend with him, one could not answer him once and 1,000 times. So he starts off with, what if I could stand before God? And it kind of starts off with, there's nothing that I could say, but he's imagining, what if one could contend with God and say, no, I'm not sinful, I don't deserve this. How would that work? Look at chapter 23 and verse 2. We're deep into it now. Chapter 23, we're going to read verses 2 through 7. Chapter 23, beginning verse 2. Today also my complaint is bitter. My hand is heavy on account of my groaning. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his seat. I would lay my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would know what he would answer me and understand what he would say to me. Would he contend with me in the greatness of his power? No, he would pay attention to me. There an upright man could argue with him, and I would be acquitted forever before my judge. If only I had a chance to tell God everything that I know that is right and true, then God would listen to me and understand. And if you know how the book of Job ends, you see what we're setting ourselves up for. Job has fallen into a trap that he knows something. And we already know from chapters 1 and 2, Job doesn't know anything. He doesn't know. He doesn't know why this is happening, and neither do his friends. But Job has fallen into a trap that he understands the way that the world works, and that he knows something about it, and that only if he could say it to God, then God would listen to him and God would answer him. And if Job makes a mistake in all of his arguments, his mistake is thinking that he knows. Because we know that he doesn't know. He doesn't understand what's going on. So you go through all of these things. Then look at chapter 25, since we're here real quick. Job, as you go through the book, this is the Facebook 1.0 continued conversation. Job's speeches get longer and longer and longer. He's got more to say, and his friends have less and less to say. So that in the last cycle here, chapter 25, there's only 6 verses. Bildad you know what, Job, this is in God's hands. And then Job replies, and it's a pretty long reply, and he pauses for just a second, and Zophar doesn't even respond. Zophar's logged off at this point. He doesn't even want to engage anymore. And so there's the 3 cycles of Job with his friends. Now here's here's something that you'll have to figure out for yourself, because I don't know exactly what to do with this. In my Bible, I have a heading over chapter 28 that says, Job continues, where is wisdom? I'm not sure that this is actually Job still speaking. What this seems to be is I would call it like an interlude. Whoever is writing the book of Job, this is the narrator throwing a wisdom poem into the middle of this book. Right after, and you see where chapter 28 falls, like right after the 3 cycles of Job with his friends, it's like the narrator says, hey, let me tell you something. And the wisdom poem is basically 3 sections. Section 1 starts in verse 1. It says, surely there is a mine for silver, and a place for gold that they refine. Iron is taken out of the earth. And what he does all throughout this section is he says, man, in all of his wisdom and technology, we can dig anything out of the ground. We can get anything we want. In verse 12, but where shall wisdom be found? We can find iron and gold and dig in the ground, and we can search out all of these things, but where are we going to find wisdom? How are we going to get our hands on that? From where does it come? In verse 20. And where is the place of understanding? We don't know where wisdom is, but I guess that last section starts in verse 20. But in verse 23, you get to the 3rd section of this wisdom poem, which is, God understands the way to it, and he knows its place. He looks to the ends of the earth and sees everything under the heavens. And the wisdom is, we can find anything except wisdom. Where can we get wisdom? And it ends by saying God is the only one who knows about wisdom or where it's found or how to get to it. That's the one and only spot. And so 28 seems to be, at least the message of 28 seems to be really insightful for what's going on in this book. What am I supposed to take away from this book? And if this is the narrator inserting his thought, hey, wisdom is only found with God, that's probably a pretty good heading for the book of Job. Wisdom is only found with God. It's sure not found with Job's 3 friends. Okay, and then Job finishes up. Maybe that is just a part of Job's talk, and he says something that's really smart. Then, chapter 32, I'm not going to go through Elihu's speeches, or Elihu, however you want to say that, but this section is very frustrating to me. Chapter 32 to 37, Elihu, look at how it starts out, 32 in verse 1. So these 3 men ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. They're like, well, we don't have anything else that we can say for you if you think that you're all good and fine. He was all good and fine. He didn't do anything to bring this on himself. Verse 2, then Elihu the son of Barachel the Buzite of the family of Ram burned with hot anger. He burned with anger at Job because he justified himself rather than God. And he burned with anger also at Job's 3 friends because they had found no answer, although they had declared Job to be in the wrong. So they were not able to prove their case, and it makes Elihu really mad. Elihu had waited to speak to Job because they were older than he. And when Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouth of these 3 men, he burned with anger. And Elihu goes on these long 4 speeches. And I say that it's 4 speeches because look at the end of chapter 33. It seems like he stops and it says, if not, listen to me, be silent, and I will teach you wisdom. And then in chapter 34 it says, then Elihu answered and said. And so it seems like here is speech number 1, and he stops and he's like, what do you got to say? We've been doing give and take in cycle 1, 2, and 3. And he stops, what do you got to say? And nobody says anything. And so he just keeps on going. And he seems to do it 4 different times. And the frustrating thing about Elihu So here's what, okay, I try to be a little bit careful about this one because Becky's brother named their son Eli. And I don't want to be the one to say, Elihu didn't know what he was talking about either. Andy is just convinced. Andy says Elihu is probably the narrator of this whole book, and Elihu lays out wisdom. But the idea of Elihu is, where does he come from? He just sort of appears. What in the world does he say? Is it good or bad? And then he disappears and there's no more Elihu. And it's like, I don't know what to do with Elihu. I'm just telling you, like, I have no answer on Elihu. And so then you come to chapter 38 in verse 1. Now, God is going to chime in. The Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. And so God starts to ask Job a bunch of questions that no human has the answer to. Listen to just this, we won't read it all, but look, verse 4. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know, or stretched out the line upon it, or on what would its basis sunk, or who laid its cornerstone? And God just goes through 2 chapters of this, 38 and 39, and does what Job 28 said. This is where wisdom can be found. Only with God. He is the one that knows. And it's like Job has been saying all along, I want my day in court. I want to stand before God and I'll tell God what's what. And here comes God and God says, all right, Job, tell me what's what. And Job's response in chapter 40 in verse 1, the Lord said to Job, shall a fault finder contend with the Almighty? He who argues with God, let him answer it. And Job answered the Lord and said, these are some of the best, smartest words spoken in the whole book. Behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once, and I will not answer. Twice, and I will proceed no further. So Job is actually confronted with the presence of God. And Job's attitude changes immediately so that he says, you know what? Maybe I don't know. Maybe I don't have all the answers. And so God is not finished with him. In verse 6, the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. And he said, dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. And what he does in this section, starting in verse 15, he says, look, there's the behemoth. And then he says in 41 and verse 1, he says, can you draw out the Leviathan? These two things are considered horrible forces of, well, some people would say the behemoth is a hippopotamus and the Leviathan is like a Nile crocodile or something like that. Two things that I think I saw one time that the hippopotamus kills way more humans than most other animals. Like a horrible animal if you're a person living in this time. And a crocodile, I mean, who wants to mess with a crocodile? And God talks about them like they're his pets. I tell them what they do, and they roll over, and I rub their belly. He doesn't really say that. But that's the basic gist of the way that he talks about these two horrible forces of nature that destroy human life, and there's nothing that anybody can do about them. In verse 1 of chapter 42, Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore, I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Hear, and I will speak. I will question you, and you make it known to me. This is what Job had said. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. And so in verse 7, this is the end. After the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, my anger burns against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. And what some people will do with that is they'll say, look back at all of the things that Job said throughout his speeches, and God says that he's right. And I don't think that's right at all. I think what God says is Job said what was right about God, in that I don't have any idea what's going on. I'll put my hand over my mouth and I repent that I pretended like I did know what was going on. And I think that's what God says. Job has figured it out. He figured out humility. He figured out some level of understanding. And so look at what happens in verse 8. Now, therefore, take 7 bulls and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job and offer up a burnt offering for yourselves, and my servant Job will pray for you. Just like Job was interceding for his family, at the end of the book, Job is interceding for his 3 friends. And so that is a big overview of the book of Job. And I won't... Let's see. I'm running short on time. I'll skip over some of these things, but let me at least get to this one. I already told you what I think the main point of Job is. I think the main point of Job is he and his friends didn't know what was going on, and their mistake was to talk as if they did. That was their mistake. And the way that they were right with God in the end was through repenting. But that's the thing. Listen and see if this sounds familiar to you. A description of the book of Job. Here is a man who is genuinely righteous, but he suffers, not because he deserves it, and not as some kind of punishment from God, but because of Satan's work in the world. And so he throws himself in faith at God's feet and yields to God's will. He's ultimately vindicated at the end of the story, and now he lives to intercede on behalf of his friends who were wrong the whole time. If you talk about the story of Job in big swaths like that, it's the story of Jesus. And we're Christians, and the story of Jesus is the centerpiece of everything that we do and everything that we are. And so if you want to take something from the book of Job away from the story, it is that sometimes righteous people do suffer, even though they may not deserve it. Just like Jesus, who was entirely righteous, did nothing wrong, but still suffered. And just like you see in the story of Job and the story of Jesus, God ultimately will vindicate those who are his people. That's our hope. And so this is my one-sentence summary for the whole book of Job. It's that last section of Habakkuk that we spent all that time talking about. This, if I'm going to learn my lesson from the book of Job, these 3 verses are it. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit on the vines, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. If I'm Job and everything goes bad, that's what he says. If I lose everything and everything is rotten and everything goes bad, verse 18, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on high places. To the choir master with strings. I shouldn't have put that part on the end. But there it is, I suppose. Kevin picked a really good song for the invitation song. And this is the thing that I'd ask you to think about. When God says that he will vindicate the righteous, if you're a Christian, that is not a gospel of health and wealth. It might not come in this lifetime. You might live your whole life suffering as Job did, or as Habakkuk talked about. But when you're a Christian, your hope, our hope, is in the resurrection of Jesus. Jesus' resurrection and the resurrection that we're promised because of that when this passing world is done. And so if you want to put your hope in Jesus and you want to be a part of this, come forward, make your needs known as together we stand and sing the invitation song.